Like, that's okay. That's okay. Why is this stuff important? In college, I was in a college biology class, and they began to teach about evolution and some different things, and I raised my hand and said, listen, I just don't really believe in this. And then the teacher went to bully me and lower my grade in class. Lost a letter grade in that class. I knew at that point in college that I believed in a literal Adam and Eve because God believes, and Jesus speaks of a literal Adam and Eve. And if Jesus believes in a literal Adam and Eve, I'm going to believe. That just makes sense to me, right? But I didn't understand the science of different things, and so I wasn't able to stand up for myself. And I felt almost like I made God look bad and weak in that situation. It's important to know why we believe what we believe, right? And so I'm glad to have Keaton with us today. I'm going to pray for us. I'm going to turn it over to him. So this is session 1. Session 2, I'm expecting tenfold the amount of people. We're going to pray for God like loaves of fishes and things. But God, we come before you. We acknowledge your goodness. We pray for you to guide us. Help us to know and to stand on solid ground. God, whenever you say something, that is good enough. But you challenge us and you make us inquisitive and curious. And you give us an entire world around to think about and to ponder and to study. God, science is not void of religion. They go hand in hand. Lord, I just pray that you would help us to understand you even better today as Keaton speaks to us. You are a good God. Amen.
All right, good morning. Well, I completely agree with Brandon that this is an important subject for us to understand in order to be able to stand up for our faith when we're confronted with those challenging situations. And when non-Christians ask us, why do you believe the things that you do? We can have more confidence in our own faith if we know why we believe, and then we can maybe stand up to those challenges and help to show others, to point them to the truth of biblical creation. So our ministry is all about biblical creation, helping people to see that science is not in conflict with Scripture. When science is rightly understood, these things go together. So we employ a lot of nerds and PhD scientists that help to show that the Bible is trustworthy right from the very first verse. And so we're going to talk more in detail about those things, give an overview in the second hour, the main service this morning. But in this hour, we want to focus on the origin of living things, because that is a central part of this debate. We're going to ask how living things first came about. Were they engineered by an ingenious creator, as the Bible tells us? Or did they come about through some unguided naturalistic evolutionary process, as Charles Darwin popularized? Well, it's always struck me that no matter who you're talking to, no matter what worldview a person comes from, when all people look at the world of living things, whether we're talking about the grandeur of one of nature's greatest beasts, or the intricate details, say, on the eye of a tiny insect, everyone's first impression is that someone must have made this. Not everyone believes that, but that's the first impression that people have. You look at all the beautiful, sophisticated complexity that's evident in living things, that suggests that these things were designed. If they were designed, that implies they had a designer. And the Bible affirms that intuition that all people have. In Romans chapter 1, for example, it talks about how God is clearly understood from creation. It says God's invisible attributes, specifically that he's eternally powerful, and that it's his divine nature, that it is God behind the universe, not just some generic intelligent designer. These things have been clearly perceived, Romans 1 says. How long has that been the case? Well, ever since God made the world. And how is God clearly perceived? Well, it's in the things that have been made. And notice the end there, where it says this is so obvious to people that no one even has any excuse not to believe in God from looking at creation. Now, as I mentioned, even atheists surprisingly have this same intuition that is shared by Christians. For example, one of the world's leading atheists, Professor Richard Dawkins, who is a champion of evolution and a fierce critic of Genesis creation, notice in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, on page 1, he defines the science of biology this way. He says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So Dawkins himself, as an atheist, does not believe that living things actually were designed. He thinks he can explain away this appearance of design, but he admits they look that way, at least at first blush. Or similarly, another brilliant atheist, Francis Crick, who was one of the people who co-discovered the structure of DNA, doesn't believe in God. Notice what he says about evolution here. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Why do these brilliant men of science have to keep reminding themselves that evolution must be true despite what I'm seeing? Because even to them, the world looks like it was designed. Now, to be fair to these atheists, they think that they have a better explanation. They think what looks like design is only a superficial appearance. And it's true that we can sometimes be fooled into thinking design is present when it's not really. One of my favorite examples of this is back in 1976 when the Voyager spacecraft first flew past the surface of the planet Mars. And so we got some close-up photographs of the Martian landscape for the first time ever. Among the craters from straight up above, you can see this hillside in the center of this photo. The detail there looks like a face has been carved into the landscape, right? And so a lot of people at the time got excited and said, this is proof that an intelligent civilization of extraterrestrials must have carved this hillside to look like a face. But at the same time, I think most of us recognize that the appearance of a face is kind of superficial. It's not that compelling, right? You realize when they flew other satellites there from a different angle with different lighting, that same hillside was mapped out to look like this. And so it's really just an accidental way that light and shadows played. It's not hard to explain this type of landscape by natural processes alone. Things like gravity and erosion and so forth can form this shape to superficially make it look like a face. But the level of detail is where the rubber meets the road. Imagine if, when the newer satellites had flown past this landscape and came back with photographs that looked more like this, then we would be certain that this was carved by an intelligent agent, right? Even if we don't know who that intelligent designer was, it's clear that this type of shape, the level of complexity and detail, the resemblance to a face that we recognize, indicates that this could not have come about by natural processes alone. Something beyond natural processes, intelligence, is required to produce shapes like this. And so atheists want to say that the appearance of design in living things is like the first instance, the actual face, the hillside on Mars. I say no, it's more like this second case. The level of details there tell us there must be a designer behind all of life. And so we're going to apply that way of thinking to 4 different arguments that you find commonly in high school textbooks, example, that try to lay out the case that molecules to man evolution is fact. But we're going to see these same 4 reasons actually help to support creation when you get into those details. When you look at the complexity and the specifics, it turns out these are not 4 good reasons to believe in evolution. They're good reasons to believe in creation. So we're going to look first at vestigial structures. That's a mouthful, but I'll explain what that is in a moment. Then we'll look at the similarities in living things, the changes that we can watch happening in the world today, in the present. And last, we'll look at the cruelty in nature. Even that, not so much a scientific argument, but it's a common way that evolutionists argue that evolution must be true and creation false. So let's take these one at a time, starting with vestigial structures. If you haven't encountered that term vestige before, a vestige is just a remnant or a trace. So these would be structures in our body that just leave behind a trace, allegedly, of our evolutionary past, right? For example, an instance of a vestige would be if you walk along a beach and find some footprints in the sand, you know that's a trace, a remnant that a human once walked there. What evolutionists say is that in our bodies, in the human body, we have many different organs and features like the tonsils, the appendix, the tailbone. These have no function, but they're just leftovers to prove that we came from ancestors that had tails and had organs that had these functional, performed functions and so forth. Now, the idea of vestigial structures in principle is not necessarily contrary to biblical creation, at least in some cases, because creationists believe that God made a good world in the beginning, and after Adam and Eve sinned, rebelled against their creator, the world was cursed, and a lot of things go wrong in biology today. We have mutations and harmful damage to things in our bodies that can cause them to cease functioning as they once did. And so when we look at different creatures in the world, like a lot of animals that live in caves are born blind. You have this common feature, blind cavefish, where instead of growing eyeballs, they just have scar tissue that grows in the place where their eyes are in their cousins. And so why are they born with these without eyes? Because they live in a dark cave and seeing doesn't give them any advantage. And so somewhere in their history, they lost the ability to see. Maybe harmful mutations damaged the genetic instructions to make their eyes. And so that is a good example of a real vestigial structure. But creationists have no problem with saying that these eyeless fish came from fish ancestors that actually had eyes. But that's a downhill type of change, breaking and damaging DNA. It's not hard to explain how to destroy eyes once you've already got them there. But what we want to know, what the evolutionists claim, is that natural processes alone can build eyes over time from scratch. That's what's hard to explain, not how to destroy eyes. And so it's true that we do have vestigial organs in some cases, but the claims that evolutionists typically make, back at the time of the Scopes trial in 1925, for example, there was one expert scientist who got on the stand, the witness stand, and said there are no less than 180 vestigial structures in the human body. But it turns out, we've learned since then, that many of these, essentially all of these structures actually do have functions. They just didn't know what they were back then. They were ignorant of the function. And the more that science progressed, the more that we learned what these things were there for. And yet this idea persists down to the present. In 2017, I visited New York, the American Museum of Natural History there, where I was astonished to come across this sign talking about the human tailbone, or coccyx. The signage there said, "Look closely at the base of the human spine, and you'll find a tailbone, 3 to 5 vertebrae fused together." It's this little triangular process, right? At the back of our hips, the bottom of our under our spinal column there. But notice the next line here. It serves no purpose, no function whatsoever in the tailbone, except it reminds us that humans have descended from ancestral animals with tails. Well, I just find this astonishing because if you consult textbooks about anatomy and physiology, they do point to functions for the tailbone. Now, it's not essential to life, just like, your pinky toe or your pinky on your hand or your entire arm. You could live without your left arm, right? You could live without both arms, technically. It doesn't prove that it has no function. And so when people break their tailbones, some cases might require it getting removed, but the rest of your body has to work harder in order to make up for the deficit. What function does the tailbone serve? Well, it's an attachment point for all kinds of muscles and ligaments that also perform functions within your body. It also helps to bear your weight as you're seated. You have 2 bones in the front of your pelvis, and the tailbone is in the rear. It forms kind of like a tripod to bear the weight as you're sitting. The more you lean back, the more weight the tailbone supports. And a variety of other functions it performs as well, given the muscles and things that are attached to it. Functions that we perform daily that I won't go into. We could also talk about other alleged vestigial structures, like the appendix. This is this little worm-like process that comes off of our intestines. And here again, you can have this removed and survive. Sometimes you might need to get it removed when you have appendicitis, for example. But sadly, the thinking still persists that this is a useless leftover of evolution, that it has no function today. My brother, for example, got in a car accident when he was in high school, and when the doctors went in and were doing surgery on his intestines, they actually snipped off the appendix because they thought, well, as long as we're here, let's just get rid of this thing. It doesn't have any function anyway. And then they charged him, removed it without his permission, and then billed him for it. But the more we've learned about the appendix, it turns out we don't fully understand everything that it's doing, but it seems to be involved in our immune system. One function that we know it has is when you get certain types of diseases where you expel the contents of your stomach, you get rid of all the good, healthy bacteria there that aid in digestion. Well, the appendix is like an extra storage place, a safe house for these good, healthy bacteria that your gut needs, and thereby they can replenish your gut from the appendix that way. And so they're not expelled out of your body entirely. It has some health purposes. But if you read the article that I've linked on the URL below the image there, that article is fascinating. It talks about how, even from an evolutionary perspective, when scientists look at how the appendix is distributed in different types of organisms, different creatures have different kinds of appendixes, but the pattern that this forms, they realized they don't believe that the appendix evolved in this lineage and then separately in this lineage, or actually they don't believe that it evolved once and then got changed in the different lineages. They actually believe it had to evolve in separate branches of the evolutionary tree just by chance over and over again, at least 18 different times. And so even from an evolutionary point of view, if the appendix is so useless, why does it keep evolving into existence again and again and again? Clearly, it's performing some important function in these organisms. But I think the Bible has the best explanation of the human body. In the Psalms, it says, "I praise you, Lord, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well." We were designed, and this claim about vestigial structures, the vast majority of those are not true at all. They actually do have functions that we've learned about over the years. So let's move on to the second argument for evolution. That is, what about the similarities that we see in living things? And a common textbook example of this that you'll find is what's called the 5-digit limb pattern. Notice in all these creatures that Bible-believing Christians would say were made separately by God, like humans and frogs are not distant cousins, not blood relatives, and yet we have this same pattern in our arms or legs. You've got one bone in your upper arm and then an elbow joint, 2 bones in the lower arm and a wrist joint, and then 5 digits in the hand. And that pattern is like throughout vertebrates. Frogs use their legs for hopping, birds use their wings for flying, seals use their flippers or whatever you call that appendage for going through the water, right? And so evolutionists say, well, clearly the reason we have all these bones with slightly different shapes but the same basic pattern is because all these organisms are related. They go back to a common ancestor millions of years ago that already had this 5-digit limb pattern. And the evolutionary process just tweaked and modified it slightly rather than reinventing the wheel wholesale and having a totally different structure in these different arms. Well, that's one possible explanation of the data that we observe, but creationists have long said there's a second possibility, though. Could it be that all these organisms have the same pattern in their bones because they had one designer, a God who created them and gave them this similar pattern? You do find in objects manufactured by humans lots of similar features. Think about, automobiles and so forth, that you've often got designers will choose to implement the same themes again and again and again, or even artists in literature and music and things, paintings, they'll repeat themes in their work, perhaps for aesthetic purposes. So are we just at a stalemate here where the evolutionists have a possible explanation and the creationists have a possible explanation, but nobody can say who's right? Well, no, I think just like that Martian landscape, when you begin to look at the details, the evolutionary story begins to fall apart. For example, take the human hand and the frog foot. If these really are similar because they inherited that pattern from a common ancestor, then as the human and the frog develop as embryos, you would expect the digits of the hand would form in identical ways. But they actually form through radically different processes. Two different routes to arrive at the same endpoint. The human hand begins like a plate, and the material in between the fingers dissolves away, whereas the frog foot begins like a stump, and the digits grow outward from initial buds. And there are lots of contradictions in the DNA evidence and things like this that defy the evolutionary explanation for the similarities. There are other instances as well where there are remarkable similarities between radically different types of living things, but no evolutionist would say the similarity proves evolution in this case. Like the camera eye lens system that we find in humans and other vertebrates compared to octopuses. Octopuses aren't even vertebrates like us. They're supposed to be far, far removed from us on the evolutionary tree. And so how come they have such an uncannily similar eye to human beings and eagles and cats and other creatures that are vertebrates? Evolutionists, again, have to say on separate branches of the evolutionary tree, just by chance, this camera lens eye system had to evolve into existence more than once. And you thought it was difficult to explain the human eye even once by blind evolutionary processes. But John Rennie of Scientific American tells us that evolutionists believe the eye has come about over 60 different times, different types of eyes and different creatures. No, I suggest this is not plausible. Blind forces of nature can't make a seeing eye. Here again, the Bible has a better explanation, that the hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. Once again, in principle, I think this argument from similarities is just a poor argument for evolution, because manufactured objects show these same patterns of similarity. You know, if you dump out all the utensils in your kitchen drawer, you can arrange them into an evolutionary tree, right? You could say, like, knives are a little bit closer to spoons than they are to forks and so forth, and you can find patterns and so forth, but it has nothing to do with kitchen utensils evolving. They were all designed objects. Or take, the evolution of the taco, Mexican food. Did tacos, soft tacos and hard tacos both come from a tortilla millions of years ago? No, these are designed objects by intelligent agents. So we've looked at two arguments so far for evolution, the idea of vestigial structures, then the similarities in living things. What about the way I was taught to believe in evolution when I was in high school, focusing primarily on the changes that we can observe happening today? Don't living things change over time? Well, absolutely they do, and creationists long before Charles Darwin understood this. If you just look at all the varieties of domestic dogs that we have in the world today, these dogs were not around back at the time of the Garden of Eden, right? Because they're modern breeds that have been developed by human breeders, choosing certain types of dogs and mating them with each other to emphasize certain traits. Okay, so there weren't any Chihuahuas or Great Danes or Poodles or Dachshunds back at the time of Adam and Eve. Creationists, we didn't need Charles Darwin to tell us that living things can change over time. And humans can even get involved in that process and cause certain little scrappy types of dogs to come about. But we, at the same time, have recognized that these changes aren't like infinitely plastic. There are limits to what's possible. All the dogs may be related, but they're not related to cats or anteaters or amoebas, right? And the Bible would lead us to expect both things, that animals can change over time, but that changes have limits. For example, the Bible teaches that all the land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures that we have in the world today, basically the land vertebrates, all the different species we have today, can trace their ancestry back to just the original kinds that were aboard Noah's Ark. And there weren't millions and millions of creatures on board Noah's Ark. There were just two of each basic type of creature. And with a small subset of the animals, the clean animals, there were probably 14 of each of those. 7 sevens is the way the Bible puts it. But the vast majority of animals, just a male and a female of each. And so it was probably like a wolf-like creature on the ark, from which we've developed wolves and coyotes and dingoes and all of our domestic dogs and so forth, right? So The diversification after the flood is what we would expect based on comparing the animals we have today, the changes that we see, to what the Bible says about all the animals going on board the ark thousands of years ago. But even though the Bible leads us to expect change after the flood, it does say that God made distinct kinds of animals and plants supernaturally in the beginning, and he created them according to basic kinds. So I don't think one kind of creature can change into another. You can have multiple species within each kind, but each kind stays consistent with its type. Right? And that fits with our experience. When mom comes home with the hospital, you don't wonder if the baby this time might look like a chimpanzee. It's going to be a human if it was produced by human beings. Genesis 1, of course, talks about God making distinct types on distinct days as well. A swimming distinction between the biblical term kind and a scientific species. These are not the same thing because we classify cats into different species. Lions are a different species from tigers, and yet most creation scientists believe that these are actually the same kind. There's really only one cat kind. And we know that because you can breed a lion and a tiger together. Do you know what you get when you cross a male lion and a female tiger? You get a liger. And these are actually real large, healthy cats. They're not mythological animals with magic powers. No, these are strong, healthy cats. And it shows that the biblical kind is broader than our modern day species because God put a lot of potential into the original cat kind's potential for variation and diversification. And within each kind, you can sometimes have new species forming as one population takes a subset of the genetic information with them to a certain region, and they don't tend to breed with another type. The environment can cause them to develop these distinct variations and then not tend to breed together even when you bring them back together in the wild. Now, it's not just cats, though. We can look at some mammals as an example here of different hybrids. If you cross a camel and a llama to get a beefalo, zebra and a donkey makes a zonkey, zebra and a horse makes a zorse, a goat and a sheep makes a jeep. And by the way, there are some artificial geeps that are produced, by scientists, but there are some natural hybrids as well. Pig and a boar cross, I don't even know what to call that one. Dinner, somebody said once. Sometimes polar bears and grizzly bears will breed together in the wild to produce growlers or pizzly bears in some cases. And at SeaWorld one time, they had what's called a false killer whale in the same tank with a bottlenose dolphin. And eventually one of them became pregnant, and it surprised the curators. And along came a baby wholphin calf. So I can give heaps more examples of this with plants and different types of organisms, not just mammals. But the point is the biblical kind is a broader category, and oftentimes within a single biblical kind, you can have lots of variation and diversification. Oops, sorry about that. As God just put a lot of that potential in these organisms to begin with. And yet, the changes have limits. Yeah, zebras and donkeys and horses and mules, they're all related, but they're not all related to the dolphin, right? You can see the distinctions there fairly intuitively. And creation scientists work to analyze and explore what are the limits, the boundaries of the original created kinds. How far, how extensive can these changes take place? But just the fact that we see change happening doesn't prove evolution in the molecules to man sense. And notice the way I qualify what I mean by evolution there, because we certainly do believe that variation, speciation, natural selection, mutations, these are real processes. But this is how students often get confused. The professor might tell them, how can you deny evolution? I observe it happening. We see these variations in butterflies, for example. Evolution is happening in my lab. It's a fact. But when the student hears the word evolution, what's really being communicated is not just changes within a kind, it's changes that cross the kind boundaries. It's the idea that microbes turned into mankind over millions of years. Now that's the idea that we're denying. Universal common ancestry. We need to distinguish that between what's also called evolution sometimes. Same term evolution applied to both things, but these are very different concepts. The changes that we observe actually tend to go downhill in a sense, because they destroy the genetic information that God originally put into these organisms. What do I mean by genetic information here? Well, we're talking about the DNA, right? And if you don't know what DNA stands for, I like to say it stands for definitely no accident, because the DNA contains instructions to make the proteins in our body. It's like a language where the chemicals are like letters in an alphabet. There's 4 different chemical letters in DNA, and it's the arrangement of those letters, not the chemistry and the physics that spells out the information. It's just like the ink on a page in a book. It's not the ink and the paper molecules that give you the information in the book. It's the arrangement of the alphabetic letters. And the same thing is true in DNA. There is a genetic code, and what's written in our DNA is instructions to make our bodies. And it's not just a little bit of information. Books and books worth. As Richard Dawkins says, there's enough information capacity in a single human cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30 volumes of it, 3 or 4 times over. And the challenge then for the evolutionists, because they claim that all living things can trace their origin back to a single-celled ancestor millions of years ago, it's in that evolutionary history are the natural processes that we do observe. When we see living things changing, the types of changes that are occurring are these of the sort that write brand new genetic instructions and build up new information to make machines that we find in our cells and so forth. No, the changes that we observe are destroying information. Rather than the observed changes producing complex new information, the typical examples that supposedly prove evolution, the changes in peppered moths and Darwin's finches and so forth, these are breaking and damaging and destroying the information, not writing new complex instructions. Right? So evolutionists want us to believe that a ball can fall all the way up an entire flight of stairs. And when they point to balls falling downstairs, that's not enough to prove their theory. We never even see balls jumping up a single step, let alone climbing all the way to the top. And so when they point to things like natural selection, again, natural selection is a real feature of the world, but it's not a process that creates the new information that evolution needs. For example, think about dogs again. We see a lot of variety in dog breeds, but human breeders have gotten involved in producing these differences. But even the differences we see in the natural world between wolves, coyotes, dogs, dingoes, and jackals, natural selection is responsible for a lot of that diversity. And how does this work? Imagine a couple of wolf-like creatures coming off of Noah's Ark. And to illustrate how genetics works in some cases, we'll illustrate using 2 letters to stand for the genes that code for the length of their fur. So imagine there's only 2 genes, and this is maybe not the real truth about the world, but the principles are what's true here. So I'm just giving you a kind of a simplified example. Imagine the wolves have 2 genes that code for the length of their fur, and they come in 2 forms. One is L, which stands for long fur. S stands for short fur. And if they've got both of those genes, then it could have a blended effect, and they've just got medium length fur, neither long nor short. So imagine the dogs or wolves on the ark have both an L and an S gene. They've got medium fur. Now, when they have puppies after the flood, what are their offspring going to look like? Well, they get a random combination, 50% chance of getting an L from dad, and 50% chance of getting an L or an S from mom. So some of the dogs will be born with just short fur genes, meaning they'll have short fur. Others will have an L and an S, like mom and dad, about 50% of them will. And then about 25% will have just the 2 L genes. So what's happened so far is just sorting out the information that God built into these dogs to begin with, right? We haven't seen any evolution yet, even though we've gone from medium fur dogs to short fur, medium, and long fur in a single generation. But then here's where natural selection comes in. Imagine if some of these dogs live in an area where there's a severely harsh winter, maybe an ice age or something like that after the flood. In a very harsh winter, which dogs are most likely to survive that really cold climate? The dogs with the long fur, right? And who's not going to survive? Who's going to freeze to death? The dogs with the short fur, maybe even the medium fur as well. If we kill off all these dogs without the long fur, and then those dogs remaining go on to reproduce, what kind of offspring are they going to have? Only dogs with long fur, right? So that's natural selection. The environment, the nature, the harsh winter selected certain dogs for extinction, and others are the only ones that could go on to reproduce. And so on the surface here, we've transitioned from medium fur dogs down to exclusively long fur dogs. It looks like evolution is happening, right? Except the question is, did we have new information arising? No, we've actually gotten rid of information, the instructions to make short fur. So we've reduced the gene pool. There's less potential for variation in the future, right? If you move these dogs into a super hot area with harsh summers, are they going to be able to go back the other direction? Not if the genes for short fur are completely removed from the population. They'll just all die of heat stroke, right? So natural selection is a fact, but it's not the same as evolution. And this is why when you look at things like wolves, it's probably closer to the more robust ancestor. You move toward domestic varieties of dogs, you are removing information. It's less and less information, and you can get to the point where you've got very little information left at all if you've selected it all out of the population. Chihuahuas, you might say, are swimming in the shallow end of the gene pool because they've got all kinds of things that have been bred out of them. That's why they're tiny. They can't grow to large size unless they're bred back with the larger population. Chihuahuas also have a lot of defects, harmful mutations that have accumulated in their lineage. And mutations are real as well. You can have a copying mistake as the genetic instructions are being passed on from one generation to the next. So maybe a healthy parent with long, normal legs, the instructions to make legs get corrupted and they pass on a defect where their puppies are born with stubby little legs. There's different types of mutations, but a lot of them are called point mutations. This just means a single letter change in DNA. So it's a lot like typing out a phrase in English on your keyboard and accidentally hitting the wrong key. Instead of typing "to dust you shall return," you might hit an N instead of the O. So our mutation's a good example of how new genetic information can arise. Well, that is a different phrase than was in what you were copying from, right? To dust you knew instead of you. But it's also just basically gobbledygook, right? Because there is no such word, you knew, in English. And that's the way most of the changes are in DNA. Only a handful of possible combinations of letters will produce meaningful functional outcomes. The vast majority of, if you just make random changes, it's going to destroy the genetic instructions that are there in DNA, not code to make proteins and fold them properly and so forth. Now, that's not to say that in principle it's impossible for a random mutation, a random letter change, to actually create new instructions that were not there before. It's a lot like this sign that I came across in a parking lot one time. Violators will be towed and fined $50. Now, that's clearly not what the original sign makers intended this sign to say. There's a single letter typo there, right? An important E is missing. And so this sign took on a new meaning from what the original sign surely was intended to say. But you can see intuitively how that would be exceedingly rare, that a mutation just by a random accidental change would produce a meaningful sentence in English. And in the same way, in DNA, it's exceedingly rare that a random mutation would transform genetic instructions into still something that is functional and meaningful. Now, when we look at organisms that have mutations, it's pretty obvious in many cases that these are harmful defects. Like here's this rooster that has a mutation, we call it TNR, which stands for totally naked rooster, because it's damaged his ability to grow feathers. He comes into being without being able to grow feathers. It's obvious that that's a loss, right? A breaking, a destruction of the information that God programmed into these birds to begin with. But other cases might not be as obvious, like this creature here is also a bird, but he's supposed to look like this, a budgie, but he's got a mutation that causes his feathers to keep growing and growing and not stop. Well, if his feathers grow more and more, is that a good example of how mutations actually add information, new instructions? Well, no, because the bird's genome is quite complex, and it's supposed to have a switch to say, stop making feathers at this certain stage, but the switch has been broken, and so he can no longer cease producing the feathers, causing them to stop growing like God designed. And so even in these cases where it might not initially seem like a loss or a breaking and damage of DNA, it is a loss of genetic information. But what about cases where the information gets duplicated, like mistakenly copied an extra time? Take, for example, this turtle that's born with two heads. Mutant turtle, we call it. It's not ninja as far as I know, but he is a mutant. Well, think about it this way. If you have two copies of the same newspaper, you read it through 2 times, are you twice as informed the second time you've read it through? Well, only if your memory is bad, right? Because the second copy actually doesn't provide new information. It's just a duplicate. And so we don't want evolutionists to explain how to create a turtle head. Once we've already got a turtle head in existence, we want to know how these things came about to begin with. What's the natural processes that we see observing to make new genetic instructions, complicated things, just by natural processes alone? Those are the examples that we don't see. Well, it's also true that sometimes even these harmful mutations can be helpful to the organisms, allowing them to survive better in particular environments. And so I would say that there is such a thing as a beneficial mutation, but even these beneficial mutations typically are losses of information. So a good example is one that Charles Darwin himself observed. He talked about this in his writings. When he visited these various islands in the Galapagos, he noticed that some of these islands were populated by beetles that have no wings, but they look really similar to some beetles on the mainland that do have wings. And he thought, most likely these beetles are related. And I think he's absolutely right. The beetles on the islands probably lost their wings at some point in their history. And there might be a variety of reasons why this could happen. Darwin himself thought these islands are windy, and it looks like if they fly up into the air, they're more likely to get blown into the sea and drown. Now, more modern research on this says, no, that's probably not entirely right. It's more likely that they just expend a lot of energy trying to fly around in this wind, and so it's easier to walk around and find food and find a mate and so forth. And so it might be that when mutations damage the wings, that it doesn't matter. It doesn't make them any less, adapted to their environment. And so whatever the case is, it's clear that the original beetles were the winged versions, and the mutation caused the loss of these wings. So even though that's favored on these windy islands, that somehow helps them to survive and find food and find a mate better and pass on their DNA, it's a beneficial mutation in the sense that it helps them to survive by not having wings. It's still a loss of genetic information, not what we want evolutionists to explain to us. So we've looked at 3 arguments so far for evolution: the vestigial structures, the similarities in living things, the changes in living things. Let's look last at the cruelty in nature. And this isn't so much a scientific argument, but more of a theological argument, and yet it is very common for evolutionists to make theological arguments. What am I speaking of here? Well, if you've ever watched those nature programs on things like Discovery Channel, PBS, Nova, the BBC, a lot of times these are narrated by the famous British naturalist Sir David Attenborough. And he's a strong believer in evolution. But when he gives the credit to evolution for all these amazing features of nature that they document on film, so many Christians get frustrated with Attenborough, and they've written him letters saying, why don't you give the Creator the glory for the things that he has made? Well, Attenborough has a ready response that he gives on a number of occasions. He says, When you creationists talk about God creating things, you always instance beautiful things like hummingbirds, orchids, sunflowers, and so forth. But what about the cruelty in nature? I tend to think instead of a parasitic worm that is boring through the eye of a boy sitting on the bank of a river in Africa, a worm that's going to make him blind. And I ask those creationists, are you telling me that the God you believe in, who you also say is good, he's an all-merciful God who cares for each one of us individually, are you saying that God designed nature, including this parasitic worm? Because that doesn't seem to me to coincide to a God who's full of mercy. Well, I think Attenborough has a fair point here in the sense that nature is filled with a lot of horrors. Animals devouring one another and experiencing pain and death and diseases and so forth and suffering. What is the answer that we can give to Attenborough's challenge? Well, if we believe the history that's revealed to us in Genesis, it teaches us not only that God is the creator, but also that Adam and Eve rebelled against their maker, and God cursed the ground after Adam sinned. And that means because God gave Adam and Eve dominion over nature, that when they fell, creation fell along with them. And so it's important not just to defend the idea that God is the designer behind the amazing complexity and sophistication we see in living things, but also that the history in Genesis is trustworthy when it talks about not only Genesis 1 and 2, but also Genesis 3. There was a fall. It was Adam and Eve's sin that made the world broken, and that sets the stage for the whole story that Scripture lays out, the true story of the world about how God is in the business of redeeming that creation. I like the illustration another well-known creation speaker gives of this. He says he once went to a museum where there were all kinds of people standing around these amazing Greek and Roman statues, and much of the crowd, the adults, were standing there saying, "This is magnificent, marvelous, beautiful, incredible." But there was also a young boy nearby who said, "What are you folks talking about? It looks broken to me." And both of those perspectives are actually, they have some truth to them, right? There is a remnant of beauty in these statues, but they're also broken and marred. And you realize the same thing is true of the world that we live in. A lot of times when we want to witness to non-Christians, we just point to those sunflowers, orchids, sunsets, beautiful things. Can't you see that there's an amazing God who created all this and he loves us? But the non-Christian often looks at the same world like Attenborough did and says, "What are you talking about? It looks broken to me." But that's not in conflict with the Bible, is what we should share. The Bible explains both the beauty and the ugliness, the goodness and the evil, because God is ultimately good, but he's allowed evil into the world for a time to use it for his good purposes ultimately and bring a greater good out of that evil. The Bible explains why there's ugliness and brokenness and parasites and diseases and death in the world, and it goes back to the fall. But as I mentioned, God is not leaving the world in that state. And so Christianity not only explains why there are bad things in the world, but it also provides the solution. God is both the creator and the redeemer, is what the Bible describes. It says, for example, in Colossians 1, that in him, in Jesus, it's speaking of here, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And so Jesus didn't only die to rescue people out of the world, but God is going to one day make a new heavens and a new earth, right? It's going to be set right. There's going to be no more curse, no more death, no more pain, no more tears, as the book of Revelation talks about. And so how important is it for us to understand this big picture narrative of biblical history, that God made a good world in the beginning, it's broken because of sin, and God's going to make things right once again because of the work Jesus did on the cross. Well, we've looked then at 4 reasons to supposedly embrace evolution, but just like that Martian landscape, I suggest when we look at the details up close, these same 4 reasons are powerful arguments for the truth of biblical creation. For example, those vestigial structures that evolutionists talk about. Yeah, there might be some vestiges like blind eyes in cave fish, but the vast majority of these are not vestigial at all. They're just ignorant statements about we don't know what the function is yet. The more science uncovers, the more we learn actually these are amazingly designed parts of the human body. The similarities in living things don't point to common ancestry. They point to a common design based on one designer, one God who made all these things. The changes that we can observe in living things today, they're not the types of changes that build up new complex genetic instructions over time. No, they're deteriorating, they're breaking and destroying the information that God built into these creatures to begin with. And last, the cruelty in nature is not contrary to Scripture. It's not a proof that God is not good or that he doesn't exist, that evolution is the designer behind all of life. No, it's explained by the biblical teaching that God made things good initially, but they've been broken as a consequence of sin. And so, in summary, we have every reason to believe that God is the designer. Living things still shout design. The more you look at the details, the more obvious it is. And so I think we should get to know those details and learn to defend our faith, to learn to answer this claim that evolution is a proven fact. It's certainly not in the molecules to man's sense. Well, if you've enjoyed this hour together, there's lots where you can learn more about these sorts of evidences and arguments that support the truth of Genesis as history. We've got a family-friendly magazine, for example. It comes out 4 times a year. Articles about dinosaurs and fossils, things that we'll talk about next hour. There's always a fascinating feature about a different animal that God made and how it exhibits glorious design. For example, we had a cover story about the mimic octopus a few years ago. You might know that most octopuses can change their skin to camouflage themselves, but the mimic octopus stands out as extra remarkable because it changes its color, its texture, and its shape to impersonate at least 15 different other animals. Here's a short video of what this looks like. I assume this is going to play on the screen. Yeah, you can see that. So you can watch it actually impersonating, for example, a flounder, a flatfish that swims along the seafloor. Here it's going to recoil into this hole and have this black and white striped pattern to pretend to be a poisonous sea snake. There's the real sea snake on the right. Here's an example where it's imitating a lionfish, another poisonous creature that you don't want to mess with if you're a predator. There's the real lionfish on the right. Isn't that remarkable how this just imitates all these animals? Sometimes it does remarkable things that we don't entirely understand. You can watch it transform before your eyes right here. Isn't that cool? And here it is walking, apparently, along the seafloor. Lots of different animals that the mimic imitates. And so we just highlight animals like this that share about how God made so many incredible animals, and they all portray and proclaim his glory. A great DVD to show maybe non-Christian friends and neighbors if they embrace evolution is this one. It has Bible-believing scientists. So this is not a presentation that majors on the biblical teaching, but it focuses on the science and actually critiques evolution from these PhD experts who believe in biblical creation in fields not just biology, but geology and cosmology as well. Lots more resources you can browse through, like this book on dinosaurs, one of our recent ones that deals with alleged feathered dinosaurs. And you've heard this idea that birds allegedly evolved from dinosaurs. No, the Bible makes clear that God made them distinct and separately on different days of creation week. And so we critique these so-called feathered dinosaurs. And your children need to be equipped with this sort of information because their toys and their movies and their nature documentaries and their textbooks in school are going to teach them that birds are proof of evolution. Lots more on our website as well at creation.com. Lots of freebies there, videos and articles, 45 years worth of creation evidence at your fingertips. And I'll leave you with this one verse before we break here. You know, evolutionists often want to give the credit to nature itself for all the amazing designs that we see in the world. But Hebrews 3:4 says that every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. And that's what the evidence supports, that conclusion that God is the builder of all things. The design in living things is not an illusion. The more you look at those details, the more clear it becomes that creatures are the handiwork of their creator. All right, well, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your attention.